Hello and namaste to all of you. Today, in our UPSC GS series under Sustainable Development, we are taking Unit 11 of the Sustainable Development, that is Global Initiatives. In this initiatives, we are covering number 1 Introduction, point 2 Major Conferences on Environment and Development, number 3 International Convention Agreements on Sustainable Development, point 4 International Agencies, point 5 Roadblocks to Global Initiatives, and at the last summary of the Global Initiatives Unit 11. The general instructions for the students are the same, and that is they have to listen the audio number 16 very carefully with very intuition and note down 10 words in their notebooks which they can use further in their writings. Point 1 Introduction. In the 1970s, it was realized that there were limits to growth. If growth continued unbridled at the then existing rates, it was asserted that it would exhaust the limited stock of natural resources of the earth. Although technological innovations have contributed in pushing outwards the limits to growth, it is now being argued that there may be limits in terms of the carrying capacity of the environment. There is a consensus over the fact that growth without commensurate efforts without commensurate efforts at environmental protection will represent a global threat. The international community has responded to this perceived threat, and environmental protection and sustainable development concerns are a high priority on the international agenda. The last century has seen a proliferation of international legal instruments, declarations, and agreements aimed at environmental protection, whereas declarations are more general in nature, containing a general commitment to environmental protection without being legally binding. Agreements contain binding obligations for member states and deal with specific issues relating to particular environmental problems. On various occasions, the highest representatives of states and governments have got together in international conferences on environmental protection and development. The basic principles for environmental protection, such as the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, and the principle of sustainable development, etc., have also taken shape. Moreover, an international structure has been put in place which is devoted to further the objective of environmental protection. There is also talk of setting up a centralized world body, a World Environment Organization (WEO), to address the problems of environment. However, despite the intensified efforts at the international level, there are numerous challenges that must be met in order to allow these initiatives to be successful in their endeavor. Various environmental problems have been identified, some related to conservation of natural resources and ecosystems such as forests, wildlife, biodiversity, wetlands, migratory species, etc. These issues put a question mark on how much the earth can give. Other issues relate to ensuring that we stay within the limits of the carrying capacity of the environment. These issues, mostly relating to ozone depletion, global warming, hazardous wastes, persistent, persistent organic pollutants, POPs, hazardous chemicals, genetically modified organisms, GMOs, atmospheric pollution, marine pollution, etc. relate to the basic question of how much the earth can take. Because of the diversity of environmental problems, the legal regime at the international level is necessarily fragmented, with over 200 multilateral environmental agreements (MEAs), each dealing with different environmental problems. Point 2. Major conferences on environment and development. Starting with the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment in 1972, the largest gathering ever of heads of state government took place at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992, indicating the high priority accorded to the objective of environmental protection by the international community. The Stockholm Conference, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, UNCHE, more popularly known as the Stockholm Conference, held in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972, was the first step towards putting environmental concerns on the global agenda. Issues such as air and water pollution and chemical toxicity were discussed in a global forum for the first time. It was agreed at Stockholm that environmental protection required a holistic approach spanning the interconnected elements of peace, international cooperation, development, and poverty reduction. 113 states participated in the UNCHE, though only two were represented by the head of state or government, one of which was India. The Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, was a forceful presence at Stockholm, emphasizing that poverty is the biggest polluter. The Stockholm Conference resulted in the Stockholm Declaration containing 26 principles to inspire and guide the peoples of the world in the preservation and enhancement of the human environment, and an action plan containing 106 recommendations for environmental policy. The Stockholm Conference also resulted in the setting up of the United Nations Environment Programme (UNEP), a new UN machinery to serve as a catalyst in developing and coordinating an environmental focus in the programs of other organizations. Following the success of UNCHE, a number of strategic conferences were convened by the UN on issues relating to the Stockholm issues such as population, water, food, habitat, and desertification, resulting in a number of declarations and resolutions. It is interesting to note that the General Assembly resolution convening the Stockholm Conference noted that eliminating the impairment of the human environment was necessary for sound economic and social development. Thus, the linkage between environment and development has been expressed since the outset of the UNCHE. In 1987, the Brundtland Commission report entitled Our Common Future more clearly articulated the now widely accepted definition of sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The Brundtland Commission report also laid the groundwork for holding a global conference on the 20th anniversary at Stockholm. Rio Earth Summit. 20 years after the Stockholm Conference, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, popularly known as the Rio Earth Summit, was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. Rio was attended by over 100 heads of states and government, the highest ever attendance in an international conference. The Earth Summit was marked with the heightened awareness of the negative impact on the environment of human activities. The issues that were center stage at Rio included climate change, conservation of biodiversity and forests. But the Rio Earth Summit was marked with a clear-cut division of views between the countries of the North and those of the South. Developing countries south tended to view environmental concerns as a disease of the rich. The Earth Summit produced many legal instruments. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, like its predecessor, the Stockholm Declaration, laid out the principles to guide environmental protection and development activities. Agenda 21, a, volumin, a voluminous Agenda 21, a voluminous document of 40 chapters, contained the blueprint of the action in the 21st century in a number of development related sectors. It effectively integrates environment and development concerns and stresses the need for bottom up participatory and community based approaches. Two binding legal instruments were adopted on climate change and biodiversity. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) and the Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD). The first principles were also adopted, though they were not legally binding, and the negotiation process for the convention to combat desertification was also launched. The Rio Summit also laid the foundation of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development (CSD). Rio plus 5. 5 years after the Rio Earth Summit, a special session of the UN General Assembly in 1997, popularly known as Rio plus 5, devoted itself to evaluating the progress made since the Rio Summit. It pointed out it pointed to the growing problems of poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation. Rio plus 10, a 10-year assessment of the Rio outcomes. Rio plus 10 took the shape of the World Summit on Sustainable Development (WSSD) held at Johannesburg in 2002. WSSD aimed to review the progress made towards the aims set out in Agenda 21 and the impediments encountered by countries in implementing them. To accelerate the implementation of commitments and to infuse the process with political momentum. The key issues and concerns discussed at Johannesburg were the controversial and cross-cutting issues of finance, technology transfer, capacity building, trade and governance, etc. The WSSD produced the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development and the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. Apart from these world conferences that directly addressed sustainable development, various other international conferences have had an impact on sustainable development, including the Cairo Declaration of the International Conference on Population and Development 1994, the World Summit for Social Development (WSSD), the United Nations World Summit for Social Development was held in March 1995 at Copenhagen, which brought people at the center of development. Governments of different nations met and discussed three core socio-economic issues that were essential for development. They are: number one, eradication of poverty; number two, promotion of full employment; number three, fostering of social integration. In this summit, the governments agreed on 10 commitments which are as follows. Number one, create an economic, political, social, cultural, and legal environment that will enable people to achieve a social development. Number two, eradicate absolute poverty by a target date to be set by each country. Number three, support full employment as a basic policy goal. Number four, promote social integration based on the enhancement and protection of all human rights. Number five, achieve equality and equity between women and men. Number six, attain universal and equitable access to education and primary health care. Number seven, accelerate the development of Africa and the least developed countries. Number eight, ensure the ensure that structural adjustment programs include social development goals. Number nine, increase resources allocated to social development. Number 10, strengthen cooperation for social development through the UN. WSSD plus 5. After 5 years of WSSD, a follow up to the WSSD, the governments met in June 2000 and assessed progress made in combating poverty and outlines a common vision for the way forward. The emerging issues like globalization and social equity had also been discussed. Most international conferences result in the adoption of declaration and guidelines of action, generally termed as soft law. These non-legally binding instruments deal with the aims, goals, and objectives stated in broad terms, though they carry no legal obligations. They carry significant political weight. Some soft law instruments of general application include the Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment 1972, the World Conservation Strategy 1980, the World Charter for Nature 1982, the Hague Declaration 1989, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development 1992, Agenda 21, the Forest Principles, and the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development 2002. These world conferences and soft law instruments demonstrate the resolve of the international community to cooperate politically for the cause of environmental protection. Point 3. International Conventions Agreements on Sustainable Development. International Environmental Law (IEL) is the principal vehicle for international cooperation and collaboration between members of the international community for the purpose of environmental protection. Apart from the countless soft law instruments mentioned above, such as declarations and guidelines, IEL comprises over 200 multilateral environmental agreements (MEAs), some of which are discussed below. Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, especially as Waterfowl Habitat 1971. Wetlands represent a valuable habitat providing sustenance to concentrations of birds, especially waterfowl, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrate species, countless plant species, as well as human beings. Wetlands are also extremely valuable as sources of water, fisheries, timber, and energy, as well as recreation and tourism opportunities. These fragile these fragile ecosystems are, however, highly endangered from population density, overexploitation, pollution from oil spills, fishing activities, and discharges from industries, conversion of natural habitat for development purposes, etc. This convention, Ramsar Convention, one of the earlier modern global conservation treaties, was adopted in 1971 at Ramsar, Iran, and entered into force in 1975. The convention provides the framework for national action and international cooperation for the conservation and wise use of wetlands and their resources. There are 135 contracting parties to the convention with 1,235 wetland sites totaling 106.6 million hectares, including in the Ramsar list of wetlands of international importance. Though the original emphasis of the convention was on the conservation and wise use of wetlands primarily to provide habitat for water birds, the scope of the convention has broadened over the years to cover all aspects of wetland conservation and wise use. A member state of the Ramsar Convention agrees to facilitate the development of national level policies and actions, including legislation that would ensure the best possible use of its wetland resources. It must designate at least one or more suitable wetlands within its territory for inclusion in the list of wetlands of international importance, the Ramsar list, the, and promote its or their conservation or wise use. It must formulate and implement its land use planning, keeping wetland conservation considerations in mind in order to promote the wise use of all wetlands, including those not listed as Ramsar sites in their territory. It must establish nature reserves in wetlands whether or not they are included in the Ramsar list and promote training in wetland research, management and wardening. It must consult with other contracting parties about implementation of the convention, especially in case of shared wetlands, water systems or species. It must report on the progress in implementing its commitments under the convention by submitting a national report to the conference of parties once in 3 years. Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage 1972. Certain culture and natural sites are of such outstanding universal value that irrespective of the country in which they are located, they constitute a common heritage, the loss of which would be an irreparable loss to mankind, and yet most are threatened by the negative impact of overuse, pollution, unregulated tourism, development activities, etc. This convention, the World Heritage Convention, was adopted on 23 November 1972 and entered into force on 17 December 1975. The convention has a membership of 175. The primary mission of the Heritage Convention is to identify and conserve the world's cultural and natural heritage. It does this by drawing up a list of heritage sites which are cultural, natural, or mixed areas of outstanding universal value and therefore need to be preserved for all humanity. Their protection is thus to be ensured through efforts at the international level. The most significant feature of the convention is that it links together as a single effort conservation of nature and preservation of cultural sites. It views nature and culture as complementary based on the premise that cultural identity is strongly related to the natural environment in which it develops. 730 properties are currently inscribed on the World Heritage List, of which 563 are cultural sites, 144 are natural sites, and 23 are mixed sites in 125 different countries. The convention also provides for a list of World Heritage in danger, containing sites that are entitled to particular attention and emergency action. A party to the World Heritage Convention must identify and delineate the cultural and natural heritage sites on its territory. It must take all efforts to conserve the sites situated within its territory, the World Heritage Sites, as well as its national heritage. Such efforts include adopting a general policy to integrate the protection of a heritage into planning programs, setting up services for the conservation and presentation of heritage, developing scientific and technical studies and research, taking appropriate legal, scientific, technical, administrative, and financial measures, and fostering the establishment or development of national or regional training centers and encouraging scientific research and in this field. It must extend help in the identification, protection, conservation, and presentation of heritage sites located in other countries. It must not take any deliberate measures that might directly or indirectly damage cultural and natural heritage. It must submit to the World Heritage Committee an inventory of the cultural and natural heritage situated in its territory and suitable for inclusion in the World Heritage List. It must also submit reports to the General Conference of United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organizations, even ESCO UNESCO, containing information on the legislative and administrative provisions which it has adopted and other action which it has taken for the application of this convention. Every 2 years, it must pay to the World Heritage Fund contributions in the form of a uniform percentage applicable to all states, not exceeding 1% of its contribution to the regular budget of UNESCO. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora 1973. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora 1973. International trade in wildlife and wildlife products is a thriving business worth billions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of plant and animal specimens are the victims of the demand from international markets. Valuable species of wildlife suffer as a result of this demand for exotic food, leather goods, musical instruments, jewelry, timber, tourist curios, and medicines, some even being driven to extinction because trade in wildlife is spurred by demand from across borders. Efforts to counter it need to be taken at the international level. This convention, CITES, was signed on 3 March 1973 and entered into force on 1st July 1975. There are 160 parties to CITES. The primary aim of this convention is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. Accordingly, it extends varying degrees of protection to roughly 5,000 species of animals and 25,000 species of plants through the regulation of trade in wildlife products. CITES provides a general framework to be followed by the parties to the convention. Each party must then adopt its own domestic legislation to make sure that CITES is implemented at the national level. The convention subjects international trade in specimens of selected species to certain controls. It requires that all import, export, and re-export of species covered by the convention have to be authorized through a licensing system. The species covered by CITES are listed in three appendices according to the degree of protection they require. Appendix 1 includes species threatened with extinction. Trade in specimens of these species is permitted only in exceptional circumstances. Appendix 2 includes species not necessarily threatened with extinction, but in which trade must be controlled in order to avoid utilization incompatible and incompatible with their survival. Appendix 3 contains species that are protected in at least one such country that has asked other CITES parties for assistance in controlling the trade. Under the licensing system set up under the CITES regime, a specimen of a CITES listed species may be imported into, exported from or re-exported from a state party to the convention only if the appropriate document has been obtained and presented for clearance at the port of entry or exit. Different conditions apply for each appendix species, and these are laid out in the convention. Certain exceptions from the general requirements are permitted by the convention for inter alia specimen in transit, specimen that are personal or household effects, specimen bred in captivity, and those destined for scientific research. Special rules apply to such specimen. Trade with the states not party to the convention is permitted only on issuance of comparable documentation by the competent authorities in that state which conforms with the CITES requirements. A party to CITES must fulfill various commitments. It must ensure that any trade in a specimen of CITES listed species must be carried out in accordance with the provisions of the convention. It must take appropriate measures to enforce the provisions of the convention and to prohibit trade in specimen in violation. Also, proper records must be maintained of trade in specimens of CITES listed species. It must designate one or more management authorities in charge of administering the licensing system and one or more scientific authorities to advise them on the efforts of trade on the status of the species. It must submit periodic reports to the CITES Secretariat on the status of implementation of the convention, including the legislative, regulatory, and administrative measures taken to enforce the provisions of CITES. Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals 1979. Migration of wild animals is a global phenomenon. Migratory animals include terrestrial, avian, and marine species, some of the more commonly known ones being antelopes, dolphins, turtles, bats, and birds. Since migratory animals travel across national jurisdictional boundaries, they are especially vulnerable. They are biological dependent on the specific sites throughout their journey that may be located across different countries with different conservation priorities and conditions. Migratory species are therefore exposed to a wide range of threats, including habitat shrinkage in breeding areas, excessive hunting along migration routes, and degradation of feeding grounds. They thus require targeted efforts for the conservation of their entire range. This convention, also known as the CMS or the Bonn Convention, was adopted on 23 June 1979 in Bonn and entered into force on 1 November 1983. The convention currently has 80 parties. The CMS Convention is a global effort aimed at conserving terrestrial, marine, and avian migratory species throughout their range. The convention seeks to conserve migratory species and even habitats by providing protection to migratory species listed in appendices as per the level of protection they require. Appendix first lists endangered migratory species that enjoy strict protection. These include 85 as of September 2002 endangered species including the Siberian crane, the white-tailed eagle, the hawksbill turtle, and the dama gazelle and the Damagajal. Appendix second lists migratory species that require or would benefit significantly from international cooperative action. Multilateral agreements are to be concluded for the conservation and management of these migratory species. Amendment of the appendices is allowed based on the best scientific evidence available. The convention also mandates the undertaking by parties of cooperative research activities. Article 5 lays out in detail the guidelines for agreements. Several agreements have been concluded under the auspices of the CMS focusing on the conservation of bats in Europe in in Europe cetaceans cetaceans in the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, small cetaceans of the Baltic and the North Seas, seals and the Waded Sea, African African Eurasian migratory water birds, the Siberian crane, the slender-billed curlew, and marine turtles of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. By becoming a party to the CMS, a member state gives its consent to protect the migratory species of wild animals that live within or pass through its national jurisdiction and has the following obligations. It must endeavor to promote, cooperate in the support research relating to the migratory species, to provide immediate protection for migratory species included in Appendix 1, and to conclude agreements on the conservation and management of migratory species included in Appendix 2. For Appendix 1 species of which it is a range state, it must prohibit their taking unless it is for specified exceptional reasons. Also, it must endeavor to conserve and restore habitats of migratory species, minimize obstacles in migration, and prevent any factors that are endangering the species. For Appendix 2, species of which it is a range state, it must endeavor to conclude agreements to benefit the species. It must inform the Secretariat at least 6 months prior to each ordinary meeting of the Conference on measures that it has taken to implement the provisions of this convention. Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer 1985 and Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer 1987. The ozone layer found in the stratosphere between 10 to 50 km above the ground provides protection from the harmful effects of certain wavelengths of ultraviolet UV light from the sun. Specifically, UVB increases in levels of UVB radiation can result in increased incidences of skin cancers, suppression of the immunity system, eye disorders such as cataracts, etc. It also has a damaging effect on plants, animals, and plastic materials. Ozone depletion is caused by chlorofluorocarbons (CFCs), which are used in aerosols, homes, refrigeration, air conditioners, solvents, fire extinguishers, etc. Ozone depletion was confirmed by the discovery of the ozone hole over the Antarctic discovered in 1985 and observations since then confirm ozone depletion. This convention, Vienna Convention, was adopted on 22nd March 1985 and entered into force on 22nd September 1988. As per the Vienna Convention, parties agreed to take appropriate measures to prevent modification of the ozone layer. But what these appropriate measures are is not unspecified. The main thrust of the convention was to encourage research, cooperation among countries, and exchange of information. The Vienna Convention represented the first instance when nations agreed to take efforts to address a global environmental problem even before it was scientifically established. Obligations under the Vienna Convention include the following: a member must cooperate in observation, research, and information exchange on ozone layer depletion and its impact on human health and the environment. It must also cooperate in international efforts to formulate and implement the ozone regime. It must initiate and cooperate in the conduct of research and scientific observations. It must also cooperate in legal, scientific, and technical fields and transmission of information on the measures adopted by them in the implementation of this convention. It must adopt legislative and administrative measures to control, limit, reduce, or prevent human activities that have an adverse effect on the ozone layer. Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer. After the fact of ozone depletion was confirmed in a paper published in May 1985 by British scientists, followed by observations by American satellites, the Montreal Protocol was signed on 16 September 1987. The Montreal Protocol, which entered into force on 1 January 1989, outlined the specific measures to be taken in order to control the use of ozone depleting substances (ODS). The protocol aims to reduce and eventually eliminate the emissions of man-made ODS. Since its adoption, the Montreal Protocol has been modified 5 times through adjustments and amendments. Its control provisions were strengthened in London 1990, Copenhagen 1992, Vienna 1995, Montreal 1997, and Beijing 1999. Under the Montreal Protocol, a member agrees to take precautionary measures to control emissions of ODS with the ultimate objective of their elimination. The emission reduction obligations are laid out in detail in the protocol. It agrees to ban the import of the controlled substances in Annex A from non-parties. Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal 1989 and its Liability Protocol. The 1980s saw the manifestation of the NIMBY, not in my backyard, syndrome in the form of disposal of large quantities of hazardous wastes on the high seas and in small, underdeveloped and developing countries with inadequate facilities or capabilities to dispose of the waste. The unwise disposal of hazardous wastes emerged as a major environmental hazard in the face of increased generation of waste and especially hazardous waste worldwide. This convention, Basel Convention, was adopted on 22nd March 1989 and entered into force on 5 May 1992. It currently has 130 parties. The Basel Convention addresses the risk to human health and environment caused by hazardous and other wastes, and more specifically their transboundary movement. It aims at the reduction of their generation and disposal in an environmentally sound manner. A member to the Basel Convention must inform the Secretariat of National Definitions of Hazardous Wastes and also make this information available to their exporters. It must also inform other parties of their decision to prohibit the import of hazardous or other wastes for disposal in case of an accident involving hazardous or other wastes that is likely to cause harm in other states. It must ensure transmission of information. It must take appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to implement and enforce the provisions of this convention. It must also take appropriate measures to ensure that the generation of hazardous and other wastes within its jurisdiction is reduced to a minimum. Adequate disposal facilities are available. Persons involved in management of hazardous or other wastes take steps necessary to prevent pollution due to hazardous and other wastes. If pollution occurs, its consequences for human health and the environment are minimized. Transboundary movement of hazardous wastes and other wastes is reduced to the minimum and is conducted in a sound manner. A member must not permit hazardous or other waste to be exported to a non-party or to be imported from a non-party. It must also ensure that hazardous or other wastes are not exported to any state that has prohibited imports through legislation. Also, it must not allow the export of hazardous or other wastes for disposal within the area south of 60° south latitude. Most importantly, it must ensure that all trade in hazardous and other wastes that it is involved in is carried out in conformity with the provisions of this convention. It must designate a competent authority and focal point to facilitate the implementation of this convention. It must take steps to prevent illegal traffic in hazardous and other waste. Further, it must cooperate with other parties in improving environmentally sound management of wastes, developing appropriate technical guidelines and codes of practice, and promoting public awareness. Article 12 of the Basel Convention contained an obligation for parties to consult on liability. Pursuant to this provision, the liability protocol to the Basel Convention was finally adopted in 1999, a full 10 years after the adoption of the Basel Convention, indicating the difficulties in negotiating on issues of liability. Convention on Biological Diversity. Biodiversity, the variability of life on Earth, refers to the wide variety of plants, animals, and microorganisms Though around 1.75 million species have been identified so far, it is estimated that there are actually about 13 million species. The term biodiversity also incorporates genetic differences within each species as well as the variety of ecosystems. Increasing population pressure on the limited available natural resources has led to a severe and alarming loss of biodiversity. The 20th century has been a fourfold increase in population and an 18-fold growth in world economic output. This has been accompanied by unsustainable patterns of consumption and the use of environmentally unsound technologies, leading to an accelerating rate of acceleration of loss of biodiversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD) was adopted at the Rio Earth Summit on 5 June 1992 and entered into force on 29 December 1993 with 187 parties. The CBD truly boasts global membership. The CBD sets out commitments for ensuring that the global ecology does not suffer from the business of economic development. The three main goals of the CBD are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits from the use of genetic resources. Pursuant to Article 19.3 of the CBD, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, Cartagena Protocol was adopted on 29 January 2000. The protocol entered into force recently on 11 September 2003. The Cartagena Protocol seeks to protect biodiversity from the potential risks posed by living modified organisms (LMOs) resulting from biotechnology. It establishes a procedure, the Advanced Informed Agreement (AIA) procedure, for ensuring that export of LMOs takes place only with the advance and informed consent of the importing state. A member to the CBD incurs the following obligations: it must cooperate with other parties and international organizations for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. It must take general measures for conservation and sustainable use, such as developing national strategies, programs for biodiversity conservation and wise use. It must identify components of biodiversity important for its conservation and sustainable use and monitor these components. It must also identify processes and activities that are likely to have significant adverse impacts on biodiversity and monitor their effects. It must take appro- 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 it must take appropriate measures for in situ conservation of species. For instance, it must establish a system of protected areas, regulate or manage biological resources, promote the protection of ecosystems, promote environmentally sound and sustainable development in areas adjacent to protected areas, rehabilitate rehabilitate and restore degraded ecosystems, establish means to regulate the risks associated with the use and release of LMOs resulting from biotechnology, prevent the introduction of alien species, and respect the knowledge and practices of indigenous commitments. It must also develop necessary legislation and or other regulatory provisions for the protection of threatened species and cooperate in providing financial and other support for in situ conservation. A member must also adopt measures for the ex situ conservation of components of biodiversity, such as establishing facilities for ex situ conservation, adopting measures for the recovery and rehabilitation of threatened species, regulating collection of biological resources and cooperating in providing financial and other support for access to conservation. Further, it must integrate consideration of biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable use into national decision making and adopt relevant measures accordingly. It must also protect and encourage customary use of biological resources and support local populations to implement remedial action in degraded areas. Cooperation between its governmental authorities and its private sector in developing methods for sustainable use of biological resources must be encouraged. It must adopt measures that act as incentives for biodiversity conservation. Also, it must promote appropriate research and training as well as public education and awareness procedures requiring environmental impact assessment EIA of projects likely to have an impact on biodiversity must be instituted. It must try to create conditions to facilitate access to genetic resources for environmentally sound uses by other parties. It must facilitate exchange of information relevant to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. There is also an obligation of scientific and technical cooperation. This was the audio number 16. Next, international agencies we will discuss in our next audio number 17. Thank you.